He gave a starving stranger 1 plate of stew. By morning, 3 killers were dead, and a legend was born. No one knew his name, but his silence spoke louder than gunfire. This isn't just a tale, it's the meal that changed the West forever. A shocking revelation comes next, but before we uncover the truth that shook the entire frontier, make sure to hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss more stories like this, where one decision can change everything. December 3rd, 1862. The kind of night when the desert stopped pretending to be dry and turned bitter with cold. The kind that made a man's bones ache like they remembered every bad winter that came before. Silas Boone sat by his fire, boots stretched toward the low flames, hat pulled down just enough to keep the wind from biting through the crack above his collar. His cattle lay clustered behind a crude brush fence, their breath rising in slow clouds beneath the stars, and the stew bubbling in his dented tin pot was more ash than meat. But it was warm, and that counted for something. He was humming under his breath when the drifter appeared. Not walked, not rode, just appeared, like the sagebrush had peeled open and let something loose. The man didn't speak right away, just stood at the edge of the firelight, like he wasn't sure if he was alive or remembering how to be. His coat was threadbare, gray, and too long, maybe union issue in another life, and his face was part shadow, part scar, the kind of look that made most men reach for their rifle just to feel its weight. Silas didn't. Instead, he nodded once and gestured to the fire. "You hungry?" The man nodded slowly, like even that took effort. "Days," he said, voice like gravel and regret. Silas poured a ladle of stew into a tin plate and slid it toward him with his boot. No thanks came. The stranger knelt like a man praying over a grave and ate in silence. Silas didn't press. He'd shared meals with wolves and widows, and men who'd lost too much to talk. This one felt like all three. When he finally looked up, eyes catching the firelight just enough to show the worn steel behind them, Silas only said, "You riding far?" The man shrugged, chewing slow. "Far enough." That was all. But something in his voice made Silas feel like he'd just fed a storm that hadn't decided where to break yet. The fire cast long shadows that danced across the stony ground, flickering against the wagon wheel tracks and broken brush like ghosts trying to retrace old roads. And Silas poured a tin cup of coffee for the man now sitting just beyond the warmth, as if he didn't quite trust the flame not to burn what was left of him. He offered it without a word, and the stranger took it with both hands, fingers trembling slightly. Not from cold, but from the slow process of thawing something inside that had been frozen far longer than the desert wind. He drank with his eyes closed, savoring the heat like a man who didn't know if he'd ever feel it again. Silas studied him in silence. His coat was too worn to be civilian, boots too military to be coincidence, and though he carried no weapons that could be seen, the way he sat, shoulders square, back to a rock, eyes tracking every shift in the dark, told Silas this man had known battle in ways that didn't come with medals or memory. He'd seen plenty of wanderers since the war started, drifters with scorched hands and whiskey tongues, deserters who spoke in riddles or sobs. But this one was different. He didn't look lost. He looked finished, like someone who'd already walked through the final chapter of a story and was now figuring out if he was still part of the epilogue. When Silas asked him his name, the man didn't blink. "Don't carry it no more," he said, staring into the fire. "Not, I don't remember. Not, I won't say. Just don't carry it." Like a name was weight a man could set down when it got too heavy to bear. Silas didn't ask again. He just nodded, poured himself another cup, and let the fire speak for both of them. There was something in the stranger's silence that sounded louder than a man screaming. A history too raw to be told and too dangerous to forget. Whatever trail he'd come from, it wasn't marked on any map. And whatever he was running from hadn't stopped chasing. The silence between them wasn't the awkward kind that asked to be filled. It was the kind that settled in like a third man, hunkered down beside the fire with its own long memory and quiet appetite. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. The stranger ate slow, his eyes always scanning the shadows beyond the reach of the flames, while Silas rolled a cigarette with the casual precision of a man who'd watched too many nights, and with a sudden noise and blood in the dirt. Now and then, their eyes would meet across the firelight, a glance held just long enough to say, "I see you. I know." It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something close. A mutual agreement not to dig too deep, not to ask what kind of ghosts the other had tied to his boots. Silas had spent enough time alone to recognize when a man wasn't just passing through, and this one, despite the lack of baggage and the way he refused a blanket, had the look of someone anchoring himself to the moment like it might be his last. It wasn't just the way he watched the horizon. It was the way he never let the firelight touch his back. "You've been chased before," Silas finally muttered, more observation than question. The man didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. Just took another sip of coffee, slow and steady, like he was nursing something far deeper than thirst. That was all the confirmation Silas needed. This wasn't a starving rider, lost in the wilderness. This was someone measuring every moment for what it might cost him. And for reasons Silas couldn't name, he didn't mind. Maybe it was the weariness in the man's bones, the kind that mirrored his own. Or maybe it was something older, some half-remembered lesson about how men on the run don't always deserve the chasing. Whatever it was, Silas felt it tighten around them, like a thread pulled through leather. Not a friendship, not yet, but a pact. Silent, binding, and possibly before dawn, dangerous. The fire had burned low, all orange coals and soft hisses, the kind of dying light that made every scar on a man's face look deeper, older, like it had been carved there by the hand of time itself. The desert had gone quiet, too quiet for coyotes, too still for wind. And Silas Boone sat cross-legged with his back against a stump, cleaning his knife by moonlight more out of habit than need. The stranger hadn't moved much since supper, still perched near the same rock, still cradling that tin cup like it held more than coffee, like it held something he didn't dare let go. They'd spoken barely 10 words all night, but Silas couldn't shake the feeling that he was sharing ground with someone important, someone who'd seen the underbelly of the world and crawled back out with secrets smoldering behind his eyes. So he asked it, not as a probe, but as a passing thought, like someone asking if you'd ever been to St. Louis. "You fight in the war?" The words hung in the smoke, brittle and cautious. The stranger didn't look up right away, just stared into the fire like it might answer for him. Then he gave the smallest nod. "Once," he said, voice so low it barely moved the air. "Now I fight for different reasons." Silas waited, but nothing more came. No dates, no sides, no tales of battalions or blood or banners waving in righteous wind. Just that. Once. now. And something in the way he said it made Silas feel like anything more would be too dangerous to name. He knew that tone. He'd heard it in the voices of men who came home with medals and nightmares, the ones who buried their stories so deep you had to dig through the guilt to find them. Silas nodded back, slow and respectful, and threw the last piece of wood on the fire. They didn't speak again. Didn't need to. Some truths didn't come out through talk. They burned out slow, beneath the stars, in silence. By the time the first edge of sun lit up the tops of the yucca and turned the desert from gray to gold, Silas Boone stirred from his bedroll, stretched the stiffness out of his knees, and reached for the coffee pot, only to find the other bedroll cold and undisturbed. No fire embers, no footprints in the sand, no half-eaten biscuit or canteen left behind. Just empty space where a man had been the night before. It was like he'd never been there at all. Silas scanned the brush, expecting to catch the glint of a coat sleeve. Maybe a retreating silhouette on horseback. Nothing. Not even a scuff mark in the sand, as if the wind itself had conspired to erase the stranger's passing. He muttered something about damn ghosts and poured himself a cup of coffee anyway, chalking the whole thing up to a drifter with a habit for vanishing. Wasn't the first time a man with a scarred past had taken the night's warmth and slipped away before the sun could find him. By noon, Silas had saddled up and was making his way into Juniper's Hollow, planning to trade for supplies and maybe catch a bit of news from the saloon porch. But as he crested the ridge above town, his horse slowed on its own, nostrils flaring, ears pinned back. That's when Silas saw it. Thin black columns curling up from beyond the stables, smoke rising slow and bitter, like something sacred had been burned without ceremony. He kicked his horse into a trot, the kind that carried unease in its rhythm, and watched as the sky above the hollow darkened with something more than ash. Gunfire, maybe. Retribution, maybe. But deep in his gut, Silas knew this wasn't just a bad morning in a bad town. Whatever storm had broken beneath that smoke had begun long before sunrise, and the man who vanished from his camp had walked straight into it. Or worse, had caused it. The saloon doors swung slow in the wind, one hinge groaning like it still mourned the morning's chaos, and Silas dismounted in the dust without tying his reins, drawn toward the murmurs and shaken stares, like a man pulled into a funeral he wasn't invited to. The smoke was still curling from the east end of town, where the undertaker had stacked 6 canvas-wrapped bodies under a porch overhang to keep them out of the sun. Inside, the barkeep poured drinks like he was baptizing ghosts, and every voice spoke in half tones, clipped and reverent. "Stagecoach got hit," someone finally said, his voice ragged like he'd swallowed dust and gunpowder. "Federal payroll, 2 chests full, should have been guarded better." Silas listened without drinking, arms folded tight as the story unraveled in pieces. The ambush happened just outside Dry Wash Pass, an old trick of terrain where the gullies swallowed sound and bullets alike. They said the gang rode in fast, 10 or maybe 12, massed up, out for blood and coin. The guards didn't stand a chance, but then came the part that made the room go still, like the telling of a folk tale too fresh to dismiss. A single rider, face covered in a black kerchief, appeared out of nowhere, cut through the bandits like wind through wheat. Shot 3, spooked the rest, and when it was done, vanished before anyone could ask a name or offer thanks. "Moved like he knew the ground before he hit it," the witness added, like he was born from the dust itself. Silas didn't speak, didn't move, just stared into the bottom of his untouched glass. Because in the quiet description, the posture, the stillness, the untraceable departure, he heard the echoes of a man who had once sat by his fire and said nothing, a man who didn't carry a name, but carried something far heavier, a storm maybe, or a cause. And now that storm had found its first field to break on. They were gathered outside the charred stable, 3 survivors wrapped in blood-stained coats and smoke-slick fear, their voices hoarse from shouting, or maybe just from remembering too much in too little time. One of them, a younger man with a graze on his temple and eyes that hadn't yet learned how to lie, spoke slower than the others, his words fragile but firm. It wasn't just that he could shoot, he said, hands trembling as he took a sip from the flask someone had passed him. It was his eyes, cold, not cruel, just finished, like someone who's already buried what needed burying. Silas was standing a few feet back, leaning against the saloon post, hat pulled low, pretending to listen like he didn't already know the ending. But when that line dropped, his eyes, something twisted beneath his ribs. Because he remembered that firelight the night before, remembered the way the stranger had stared at the coals, like he was seeing something burn that wasn't wood. Eyes dark as the space between stars, steady like a man who'd already decided what he'd do if death came knocking. Not eyes trained on escape, but on calculation. And now that same look had ridden into gunfire and left a trail of bodies behind. Silas looked out toward the edge of town where the smoke had finally begun to thin. He imagined those eyes behind the black cloth the survivors described, imagined the stillness before the first shot, the silence afterward, the deliberate way the stranger would have faded back into the brush without taking credit or coin, just like the ghost he was. "You get a name?" someone asked the survivor. The young man shook his head. Didn't say a word, just looked at me once. Felt like he was weighing something. Silas didn't speak. Didn't need to. He'd seen that weighing happen too, across a campfire, over a tin of stew. And now he knew what came after. By nightfall, the saloon was swollen with the kind of heat that came not from the hearth, but from stories told too many times in too short a span, each retelling pouring fresh kerosene on the legend that had already begun to smolder. The piano player gave up halfway through a hymn, the same drink unfinished 3 times on the same table, and the regulars who usually kept to card games now leaned in close, eyes wide, voices low. They were talking about the writer, the one who came out of the dust like a curse or a prayer, depending on which side of the barrel you stood. Some swore he was a ghost, a revenant of the war, come back to balance debts too long ignored. Said he didn't bleed, didn't speak, didn't leave tracks. Others claimed he was divine, sent by God to deliver reckoning the law had misplaced. "You see how he moved?" one old rancher rasped, thumbing the brim of his hat like it might shield him from the memory. Like he'd already seen every shot before it was fired. A preacher who hadn't touched whiskey in 5 years ordered 2 rounds and whispered that the rider's horse bore a cross branded into its flank, though no one else had seen it. Every detail shifted, grew sharper and stranger, as though truth itself was too small to hold the weight of what the town needed to believe. And Silas Boone, sitting quiet in the back corner with his hands wrapped around a cup of bitter coffee gone cold, listened without comment. Because while the others speculated and shaped the story into whatever their guilt or hope required, Silas didn't need to wonder. He'd shared his fire with that legend, had heard his silence, seen his eyes, fed the hunger that wasn't just for food, but for something older, something broken. The whispers continued long after the whiskey ran dry, but none of them knew the truth. Silas did. And that made him the loneliest man in the room. The morning after the town began calling him legend, Silas Boone saddled his mare beneath a sun too bright for what had passed, dusting off the leather with the weariness of a man who no longer trusted quiet days. He didn't expect anything out of place, just routine, motion, the kind of simple labor that kept the mind from wandering too far back. But when he flipped the saddlebag flap, a piece of folded parchment caught the breeze and fluttered against his boot, like it had been waiting all night to be found. No wax seal, no name, no emblem, just paper, yellowed at the corners and worn thin from handling. He unfolded it with the careful hands of a man who'd handled dynamite before and found something far heavier than ink waiting inside. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate, like each stroke was chosen with military precision. Thanks for the warmth. I gave yours to others. That was it. No explanation, no promise to return, no hint of direction. Just a note that read more like a confession than a farewell. Silas stood there for a long while, the letter crumpled in his fingers, staring at the horizon like it might offer context. He thought of the stew pot over the fire, the quiet presence across the flames, the way the stranger had eaten like he was trying to remember how it felt to be human again. And now, here was proof that someone had noticed, that a simple meal had become a catalyst for something brutal, righteous, and unforgettable. Silas tucked the letter into his coat, where it pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat, and looked down at the dirt where his own boots had made their mark beside a stranger's ghost. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a ledger entry, and the debt had been paid in full, with bullets, with blood, with silence. It started as a whisper, passed over poker tables and church pews alike, gathering shape the way tumbleweeds gather thorns, quiet, aimless, and then all at once too big to ignore. By week's end, they were calling him the Meal Rider, a name born in half-drunken jest, but repeated with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints or gunslingers long dead. Nobody knew where he'd come from, and nobody could say for sure where he went after the ambush. But the story stuck like blood in the cracks of a saloon floor. A stranger rides into town with no name and no horse to boast of, accepts a meal with the silence of a starving man, then vanishes by dawn and leaves behind a trail of spent casings and justice too clean to be coincidence. They said he appeared only to those who fed him without question, only to those who offered warmth without asking for names. And in return, he left behind a reckoning. The bandits who'd hit the stagecoach were real, that much was certain. 3 were buried, 2 were missing. The payroll had been found unmolested beneath a mesquite tree, untouched except for a single bullet lodged in the iron lockbox. But it wasn't the facts that turned the story into something larger. It was the need for them. Folks who'd watched the law look the other way for too long now clung to the idea of a man who didn't need a badge to make things right. A man who moved like smoke, struck like thunder, and disappeared before the dust settled. Silas heard it all, at the blacksmith's, at the post office, over bitter coffee and whispered fears, and said nothing. He just nodded when prompted and let the legend grow, because in his heart he knew something the rest didn't. It wasn't justice that rode out that night. It was a man with no name, no past, and one warm meal in his belly. And sometimes that was all it took to tilt the world back toward balance. 3 weeks later, and 50 miles east, in the dust-bitten town of Harrow's Bluff, another story began to kindle, slow and quiet, like a fuse burning beneath floorboards. Folks there didn't talk much to outsiders. Too many years of railmen and bounty hunters passing through, too many promises that turned into graves. But when a weary farmer named Tobias Emery offered half a loaf of bread and a cup of blackstrap molasses to a stranger limping down the trail, he figured it was just Christian decency, nothing more. The man never said thank you, never gave his name, just ate with the kind of deliberate calm that made Tobias's wife uneasy, like he was measuring the flavor against the weight of something far heavier. By morning, the man was gone, and by sundown, so was Sheriff Hal Cordell. They found his badge tossed into the town well, his pistol snapped in two beside the church steps, and the door to the jailhouse swinging wide open, its lock punched clean through by a single bullet, lodged at heart height in the wooden frame. No blood, no body, just silence and a sense of something final. Cordell had ruled the town like a warden, extorting fines, beating confessions, and hanging men for whispers. And now he was gone like a bad memory scrubbed from a ledger. Some said he rode off drunk and ashamed. Others said he'd crossed the wrong outlaw. But a few, those who knew how to listen between sentences, recalled the stranger. Lean, quiet, hollow-eyed, ate like a soldier, moved like regret. The story grew teeth quickly. Soon they were whispering about the meal writer, the ghost man who answered kindness with justice, and left behind only the absence of evil. No one in Harrow's Bluff ever saw the stranger again. But the bread he'd eaten stayed warm in Tobias Emery's memory, and the town itself, once a place where fear wore a tin star, now locked its doors for different reasons. Not to keep danger out, but to honor the one night when someone offered bread to a stranger, and the next day, the darkness walked out on its own. The poster was nailed to the side of the general store, flapping against the siding like it was trying to free itself from the lie printed on it. Silas Boone spotted it while loading grain into his wagon, and for a moment he didn't believe what he was seeing, not because of the sketch, which was rough but unmistakable, but because of the name printed beneath it in thick, unforgiving ink: Elias Vane. Wanted, dead or alive. The reward was steep, 5,000 gold, enough to buy land, cattle, and a future. But it was the list of charges that made Silas's jaw clench tight. Murder, treason, theft of federal assets, desertion during wartime. It read like the sins of a madman, not a man who had sat across a fire and eaten stew with the slow grace of someone remembering how to be human again. Silas tore the poster down with one steady motion and read it again, slower this time, heart pacing like hooves on hardpan. There was no mention of the stagecoach ambush, no mention of the payroll left untouched, no mention of the lives spared in Dry Wash Pass or the vanished sheriff from Harrow's Bluff. Just a face drawn in broad strokes and a message clear as any bullet. This man does not belong in your world. End him if you see him. Silas folded the paper and tucked it into his coat, not out of guilt, but because some truths were too dangerous to leave nailed to a wall. He didn't speak of it to anyone, just rode home under a sky turning violet with storm. The paper heavy in his pocket, the name heavier still: Elias Vane. So, he had a name, after all, But Silas didn't believe it belonged to a criminal. No, that was the name of a man someone wanted buried. Not for what he'd done wrong, but for what he knew. And now that knowledge had found a voice in the whispers spreading across the desert, carried by the wind, kept alive by campfire. The kind of name you kill to silence, or feed to remember. It was old Mick Darnell who finally filled in the shadows behind the name. His voice like dry leaves scraping across a porch floor, spoken over a checkerboard and a bottle that had seen more funerals than celebrations. Silas hadn't asked. He just unfolded the poster, laid it on the table between them, and watched Mick's weathered face go still. "I knew him," Mick said after a long breath, not looking at the sketch, but through it, as if he were staring back into a place he'd locked behind his ribs. Elias Vane rode with the 32nd out of Missouri. Scout, tracker. The kind of man who could find your soul if you dropped it in a river. Fought quiet, thought quieter. The room seemed to tighten around his words as he leaned back and tapped the edge of the poster. He didn't desert. He didn't steal. He reported a massacre. Our boys, blue coats, turned loose on a Choctaw village, under the lie of rebel supply chains. Women, children, burned the whole place down while the commanding officers drank coffee and played cards. Silas sat still, the weight of it all settling in his gut like bad whiskey. Mick continued, voice now lower, like he feared the walls might repeat him. Vane filed the report to command. Thought he was doing the right thing. Next thing we knew, his own unit turned on him. Said he was compromising morale, endangering troop unity. That's Army talk for shut him up before someone important hears. He vanished not long after. Some said he was hanged in secret. Others said he went outlaw. I say he started fighting for something bigger than a flag. The poster lay between them, the ink still fresh, still accusing. Silas didn't need to speak. He just folded it again, slower this time, like a man folding a flag over a coffin, and tucked it back inside his coat. So Elias Vane wasn't a myth. He was a man broken by truth, and left for dead by the people who claimed to fight for justice. And now he rode on his own creed, born not of vengeance, but of memory. The kind that doesn't forget. The kind that doesn't forgive. It was late June when the ambush found him, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and your thoughts grow slow, the kind of day where the road looked harmless enough until it closed in on you like a trap, sprung too late to avoid. Silas Boone was 3 miles outside Paloma Ridge, driving a wagon heavy with winter supplies and a fresh coil of barbed wire when the canyon walls tightened around him like a throat. And from behind the rocks came the hiss of laughter and steel. 4 men stepped out, their faces half covered, guns already drawn, eyes already empty of reason. "Leave the mule! Drop the rifle!" one barked, a scar running from ear to jaw like a crooked map. Silas knew better than to argue with men who smiled before they robbed you. But he also knew there was no winning this clean. He raised his hands slow, measuring the distance to the shotgun under the seat. Too far. His breath caught, time stretching like leather over a drum. Then came the crack. One sharp rifle shot from somewhere high above, too far to see, but close enough to end a man mid-sentence. The one with the scar dropped first, a red bloom spreading across his chest like a warning. The other 3 turned, scrambling for cover, but the second shot came faster. Then a third. The last man ran, but fell before he reached the scrub brush. The silence afterward felt holy. Silas crouched by the wagon wheel, eyes scanning the cliffs, hand trembling as he reached for his rifle he'd never get to use. He didn't see anyone, just the wind rolling through the stone, soft and cool now, like something had shifted. But he knew. Deep in his bones, he knew. There were only a few men who could shoot like that. Only one who'd disappear before the echo faded. He looked up at the ridge and tipped his hat. "Thanks for the cover," he muttered. No reply came, just the steady hum of the heat returning. Justice, it seemed, didn't ride in with a posse. It watched from the cliffs and remembered who fed it. Silas Boone never saw Elias Vane again. Not in the flesh, not in the corners of saloons, not even in the blurred shadows of passing riders. But the man remained as real as the heat rising off desert stone, as constant as the wind that carved canyons deeper each year. The meal they shared became a quiet cornerstone of something larger, something unknowable. Word spread like prairie fire, fast and wild, and each town added its own verse to the gospel. A stranger fed in silence, who vanishes by dawn and leaves behind dead tyrants and undone evil. In some places they said he was a ghost, the soul of a betrayed soldier who rides with death in one saddlebag and justice in the other. Others whispered that he was still a man, scarred, quiet, always watching, fighting a war no one else remembered, but that still needed finishing. Folks began leaving food out near their campfires, not for charity, but in hope. A crust of bread beside a rifle, a bowl of beans facing the wind. It wasn't about belief, it was about readiness, about reminding the land that someone still remembered the cost of silence. Silas never talked much about that night under the stars, or the note he kept folded tight in his coat pocket, like a pressed flower that could still bloom if given breath. He just lived quieter, listened better, and when people came speaking of injustice, he didn't scoff. He sharpened his tools. Somewhere between Elkhorn Ridge and Harrow's Bluff, the name Elias Vane became less of a man and more of a reckoning. And all of it, every town saved, every bullet fired, every tyrant made to vanish, traced back to a tin plate of stew handed to a stranger, with nothing but shadows behind his eyes. The West didn't change with laws or speeches. It changed with a simple act of warmth offered without condition. And it was enough to turn a lost man into a legend, and a quiet fire into the spark that lit the long road toward justice.